Hey, good morning, guys. Hey, Pastor Scott here, wanting to bring you a weekly devotional. This week, we're coming to you from 1 Peter 5, 6, and 7. It says, Humble yourselves, therefore, unto God, God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast your anxiety on him, and because he cares for you. Now, that part that I want to really hit on is that idea of casting our cares upon him. Peter closed this letter in chapter 5 with the call to mutual humility and service within the body. In verse 7, then he ends it with this idea of in the first part of the thing, which is, cast all your cares and anxiety on him because he cares for you. It reminds me of a couple of things before we get into our main point, is that, again, we're regularly called to live in a place of humility and serving one another. And then ultimately we trust God with the big stuff. Because here's the thing, when I trust God with the big stuff, I'm better able to remain humble and also to serve other people. And that's, I would say, especially again important in this season. There's a lot of big stuff happening, and I really need to learn how to trust God with it. And in trusting God, it allows me to then serve others in love. See, when I take the big stuff on for myself, I tend to live in fear, mistrust, and anxiety. And I think that's kind of what God wants to deal with us with. And he also wants us to be okay with being honest with the situations we're in. To be honest, Heather and I this last couple of days kind of went through some pretty kind of scary situations with our dog. And, he had ingested some things that he shouldn't have, had to take him to the vet. And if we hadn't taken him, it probably could have done serious damage and harm. And in the midst of all that, it was really frustrating. And we were uncertain. We didn't know how serious it could have become. And it just made it for a tough day. And I kind of want to talk about that parts of the things that God calls us to cast upon him, and how sometimes it's okay that we have things that we are dealing with. In this season, a lot of us are dealing with things, and I notice two responses: either we try to ignore the reality of what's happening, or we try to fight the reality of what's happening. And in that, it kind of ends up, kind of being none of what it is that God calls us to do. And it got me thinking also with this idea of lament. Lament is this idea of how God calls us to share in our grief and suffering with him. It invites us to mourn, it invites us to grieve, it invites us to go through the tough stuff, but it reminds us to put it in his hands. It kind of goes against popular theology that kind of works like this: always look like you got it together, because otherwise people might think you don't have enough faith. And that kind of theology is inaccurate. You know, um, Quite the opposite. The Bible recognizes that we do suffer, that we face difficult seasons, and that we need to express our griefs. And so, if I honestly deal with the stuff I'm going through, and I put it before the Lord, and I'm honest about what it's doing to me, how I'm feeling, what I'm going through, this actually frees me up to continue to also then love my neighbor, serve others, show kindness. See, the problem is many of us don't lament, we complain. And when we complain, it tends to take us in a direction that isn't biblical or healthy. And so we have to be people that learn how to properly deal with the honest stuff we're going through. And this lamenting, it can be powerful, it can be necessary, and it can be good. Really, lamenting is what I said earlier, a form of grieving and suffering and mourning. David took up a lament concerning Saul and Jonathan in 2 Samuel 1. He lamented their death. Even Saul, who had gone after David, he lamented and he mourned his death. And I think lamenting, being honest before God about what we're going through, also places us again in right mindset and how to deal with these things. Lament recognizes things don't always seem right, and even at times seem unjust. Lament allows us to be honest with God about what we were going through and what we were dealing with. Lamenting is not complaining, but it's honestly sharing with God our frustrations, our concerns, and our doubts. And I often, when I preach, remind our people, listen, don't complain. Don't be complainers. Don't. But I will tell you, be honest. You can lament. You can share with God your honest frustrations and your honest griefs. Complaining is usually shallow in nature and doesn't really look for resolution. It's not biblical, and it's more tendency to be tied to grumbling, shows a lack of trust in God, and assumes the worst, and usually doesn't take into fair account what's happening. Lamenting, however, is thoughtful and places its focus on God, and complaining just really puts things more in an area of self-pity. Example, I'd say for complaining is you go to a drive-thru and they put tomato on a sandwich that you didn't want a tomato on, right? And then you tell everybody like, man, this place is terrible because they put a tomato on my sandwich when I didn't want it. That's complaining. It's also not reality, right? Lamenting, however, is saying that God, here is the burden, here is the frustration, here is what I'm carrying. It doesn't seem fair, but I'm bringing it to you, and I'm allowing myself to be honest before you, knowing I can trust you even when things don't seem to make sense. Lamenting allows us to take what we are carrying and place it before God and in his hands. And it recognizes that I still trust God even with what I'm going through. And so it's this idea that at some point, though, we also have to be honest with God. We have to recognize the seasons we're in. Not every day is a great day. Sometimes we live with this thing of like somebody always, I'm distrustful of people that always seem overly happy. You ever seen that? People that seem to always be, it's like, you ever have a bad day? And if they're honest, they have. Now, does that mean I walk around always sad and somber? No. I mean, there's a practical reality of living life, but, in the same thing, there's people that never seem to have a good day. Lamenting recognizes the seasons in life for what they honestly are. When my mom got sick, it wasn't an easy season. But it was interesting. It was a good season. I lived in a world where, you've heard it, there's the best of times and the worst of times. Shakespeare wrote that. And I remember thinking that season, man, it really was the worst of times, but it also had some great moments in that season. See, I was at Bethany College, had some great friends, was pursuing the education I wanted. And in the midst of these great things happening was also one of the most difficult seasons of my life. Lament recognizes the good in the difficult seasons and also the difficult situations in good seasons. It allows me to be honest with God with what I'm going through. And I remember I drive home and I would just say, God, I don't get this. Because I had very honest prayers with God. At times I would get angry and say, God, why is this happening? And I would be like, God, why are you allowing this person why is my mom suffering when it seems like she doesn't deserve it, but yet this other person seems like they're getting away with just all kinds of evil? I was lamenting. I was being honest before God, but I was still trusting that God was able to do what he said, and trusting that he was still who he was, and he still was in control. So how does lamenting help us? How does having honest prayers before God help us in this season? It allows us to realize that not everything is okay, and that's okay. It reminds me that I can speak to God honestly about what I'm going through. It reminds me to continue to place my trust in God and knowing that so much is out of my control, but not out of his. And it reminds me that I don't complain, I trust. I move forward. I keep putting it before the Lord, and I know that he is leading. I like what one person said. Biblical lament affirms that suffering is real and spiritually significant, but not hopeless. In his mercy, our God has given us a form of language that bends his ear and pulls his heart. Because I invite you to be honest before God today. Put your needs before him. Put your frustrations and your cares before him. Because in doing that, we put it in its rightful place so that we can then live out the life that God calls us to, even in the difficult seasons. And so I invite you to that today. Have a great day, guys. Hope to see you online Sunday, and we'll have one of these devotions again next week.